There we go. Yeah, I'm coming to you live from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm down here visiting my kids for the holiday, and I'll be back to Minneapolis this evening. Let me see if I can show you very quickly. This is just my laptop here, but out my window, um, you can see this is what's known as the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis. It's right by the arch, which I can't see out my window because I got a cheap hotel room, but it's to my left over here. The old courthouse is famous for the Dred Scott decision that actually, interestingly enough, the state of Missouri decided in favor of the Scots to set them free as from their slavery. The U.S. Supreme Court, however, went back on that decision, and they did remain in slavery. A very sad part of American history from the 1850s, and one of the things that led to the American Civil War, which the state of Missouri stayed out of, even though there was a great deal of Confederate sympathy here. And they stayed out because of a Unitarian minister, Mr. Reverend Eliot. Who was a forebear of T.S. Eliot, the poet, who was also born in St. Louis. So a little bit of history there going on. And the courthouse is also famous for the fact that we forget when we talk about slavery that slaves were property just like jewelry. And so when someone died who did not have heirs, the slaves were sold on the courthouse steps out here. As part of the property settlements. And again, very sad part of American history. Hannibal, Missouri is just up the river here where good old Mark Twain is from. And it's my stomping ground. My family farm is about 2.5-hour drive to the southeast of here. So we got questions going on this morning, and let's see, good one. Will there be audio or just live written chat? You should be picking up audio at this point. Are you picking up audio? Just making sure. I'm the only one on this morning because we're letting the tech team and all the staff have some time off. So I decided I will just do this myself. Okay, yay, thanks, Jacob. Okay, yes, good, good. Well, the question box questions kind of focused up around a particular theme this time, maybe because we're thinking about July the 4th, but a little bit of history of Unitarianism and Universalism. How did we get where we are today? Which basically is an umbrella kind of religious tradition in which we have Buddhists and atheists and humanists and Christians, etc. How did we get to that kind of a place given the history of Unitarianism and Universalism? So let me share this screen. If you do some Googling, you can find everywhere, because Unitarian Universalists are nothing if not very good at writing stuff down. So you can find UU timelines everywhere. This one I like because it has a little bit of prose explanation as to what these things mean if you're not quite up to all of this. But yeah, we trace our beginnings of Unitarian and Universalism all the way back to the beginning days of Christianity. Christianity, of course, was not a particular movement early on. It only starts framing up with the Nicene Creed at 325, when Constantine the Great says, yes, you Christians, you get to exist, you get to rule the empire, we're all going to be Christians soon, but you got to tell me what kind of Christian you're going to be. And so they got together and got in an argument, and then the Trinity actually was God by committee. Constantine decided there has to be a Trinity because there were all of these different ideas were going on. Was Jesus a human being? Was Jesus God? If Jesus was God, is there another God? And then went on and on. The Unitarians said there's one God, just like the Muslims believe, just as the Jewish tradition believes, and Jesus was a human being. That's Unitarian. But this was described as a heresy and put down by the Nicene Creed, and that's really where we begin. And it's an idea that was suppressed. It was just as legit as any other, but as they were cracking down on what kind of Christian you could be, the Nicene Creed, which some of you know by heart, was declared it, and the Arian heresy was no longer allowed. Arian, is kind of a confusing term. It's Arius, who was a bishop, a Christian bishop, who believed in Unitarian belief system. Universalism is also from this time period. It's also a heresy that was floating around, and that is that all people go to some kind of paradise when they die. There's no eternal punishment in hell. Again, this was the powers that were said, nope, we're not going to have it that way, that you do get punished eternally. So you Universalists have to shut up and sit down. And as you notice, one of the things on my little timeline here is then, oh, fast forward 1,000 years. We used to call it the Dark Ages. That's considered not very descriptive anymore. But certainly this 1,000-year period in which the Roman Empire and then all of Europe become Christian, and there is a Christian hegemony over all of Europe. All the way up to Scotland, all the way up to Denmark, and etc. Well, then things began to get a little bit interesting. And in 1531, Michael Cervetis publishes On the Errors of the Trinity. Now, Michael Cervetis was a polymath. We have one of our UU congregations in the cities named after him. He comes from Spain. And one of the arguments for why he was able to think what he thought is that the Islamic influence was still very strong there. And the Muslims are Unitarian. They think there's one God. And yes, Muhammad is his prophet, but he's just a human being. And they considered it heretical to think that Jesus was more than a human being, as a matter of fact. So this idea is floating around in the Spain of the time, and Michael Cervetis probably heard a lot about it growing up. Then he writes a book called On the Errors of the Trinity. It's a painstaking reading of the Latin Bible that says that no, the Trinity is just not there. You can't find it. It's not there. So that sets up a very early on the idea that's going to become the Reformation. Then most of you know that the idea of Trinitarianism, which holds sway in Europe, drives the Unitarians farther and farther toward the east into Central Europe. Transylvania becomes the only kingdom ever with a Unitarian king. And Francis David, you've also heard of, probably. Socinians, these people are preaching the idea that Jesus is a great human being, a prophet, but only a human being. And this Unitarian idea is protected in Eastern Europe by the Muslim influence. Again, it's kind of interesting that way that the Muslims of this time period were protecting heretical Christians and Jews because the Christians were Trinitarians and trying to crack down on the other influences. Now, one of the interesting things about UU history is that we can trace this all the way back to the beginnings of Christianity, but then what does it really look like in Eastern Europe? Some of you have been to the Unitarian sites in Eastern Europe, and you know that the Unitarians there are still Christian. So how does this happen? Well, the idea moves up to England, and you're going to begin seeing the English names here, 18th century English folk, including George de Binville, who was a Universalist who moves to the United States of the time, Pennsylvania specifically. John Murray is another of the Universalists who set up their belief systems and begin to build churches. Now, meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation occurs, and we get the Puritans, the Calvinists, who come and settle in Massachusetts. And indeed, Unitarians are directly evolved out of the very Puritanic view from that time period. How could that happen? Well, Massachusetts Bay Colony was actually a corporation. It had a board of directors that were church people, Puritans, and they said to the king, King, no, you can't allow the Anglicans into our little colony. We have this piece of paper that says that we are in charge of our corporation, and we will not let any other religious tradition in. That's kind of an ugly beginning for Unitarianism in the US, but that is what happened. And along the way, they build this little thing called Harvard College in order to train Puritan ministers. And they are trained very, very well. They're very educated, and they're in contact with other currents of religious thinking, especially from Germany. The Germany of this time period, we're talking, Immanuel Kant and that kind of thing. The universities are very open in the Germanic territories, unlike England, where they were really completely controlled by the Anglican tradition. And if you were a professor at Oxford, you couldn't say certain things. But in Germany, there really is suddenly a free hand to do theology. And the German theologians begin to think about these things again. And then the Unitarian ministers are Harvard grads, Puritans, who begin to read this material and say, oh yeah, they're right. Jesus was a human being. As a matter of fact, no miracles don't happen. As a matter of fact, just look, it's science. So there's something wrong with this book that we call God's holy word. And so that's really how the Unitarian tradition begins. The United Church of Christ, UCC, is the other side of the Puritans. It's very interesting, the Trinitarian side. It's very interesting when you stop and think about it. That both of those Puritan traditions that came over in the 1620s are now the super liberals. The UCC church being the absolute most liberal of the Christian traditions. Congregationalists, they were called for many years. And then the Unitarians. Then what begins to happen, and yes, by the way, if you go to Plymouth Rock today, you will see a nice wood frame church that was the Pilgrim Church at Plymouth, and it was a Unitarian. It's one of the oldest of the church buildings, I think the oldest in continuous use in the United States today. And so that's how this begins. They are still a state religion at this time period. That is later changed by law because the Universalists and the Baptists began to really complain about this kind of stuff, right? And they eventually get out of this very theistic viewpoint of running the state, in which you pay your taxes and that goes directly to Unitarian ministers. Yeah, we don't do that anymore. Well, at that point, Unitarianism was definitely a Christian tradition. It's just a little bit different than the Trinitarian Christian tradition, but definitely believed in the tenets of Christianity. But along comes the Transcendentalists, and we have here Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Of course, you have Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, one of the first women journalists in the United States, and then the Universalists ordained Olympia Brown there in Wisconsin. We still have an Olympia Brown church in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And all of this begins a ferment of ideas. And the Transcendentalists really, here in the US, are really German idealists. They're getting their ideas from what we call Romanticism if we study it from European terms. So you got Goethe, you've got William Wordsworth and Coleridge in the United Kingdom. Coleridge is a very important poet if you study English literature, but he's also a very important theologian. We don't think of him that way anymore, but the Ralph Waldo Emersons of the day were reading Coleridge. And if you want to look at the book, it's about 3 inches thick. He was an addict, opium addict, and came and went in terms of just how conscious he was, and he plagiarized madly. Apparently, he had a photographic memory and was able to translate German into English in his head, and he would simply steal vast numbers of pages from German philosophers and theologians. But he was very important to the early Transcendentalist movement. Although I think most people find him completely unreadable today in terms of the biologia that he wrote. It's not fun reading, but some of his poems are still fun. But so he's very important and gets the Transcendentalist thinking. And then also we have these new ideas coming in. We have Hinduism being discovered by first Germans, then the Brits, and then it comes into the US. Now, what does this mean? Well, the idea that God encompasses everything is some kind of a consciousness that is out there. That is directly comes into the Transcendentalist way of thinking. Early Buddhism, to some extent, was floating around at that time. Thoreau especially was enamored with Hindu thinking. And interestingly enough, a couple of Unitarian women, the Peabody sisters, Peabody, but they pronounce it Peabody, in Massachusetts, become the first translators of Hindu texts in the United States. The patriarchy being what it was, Thoreau was important because he was a guy. The Peabody sisters were not important because they were women, but they were the ones who were actually doing the translating out of German that was translating out of Sanskrit. So that's how that kind of thing worked. Why? Because women were not allowed in the United States at that time period to study ancient and dead literature. So women could not learn Latin and women could not learn Greek. They could only learn contemporary languages, which would make them, more fun at parties or whatever, or traveling in Europe and that kind of stuff. But the Peabody sisters used that ability to bring in this new idea of Vedic Hinduism. And it becomes embedded in the ideas of Transcendentalism. Now, wait a minute here. What's this Jesus guy over here? And then suddenly we have this God that has no personality at all. It's a consciousness. How's that going to work together? Well, it never does. That's part of the Unitarian tradition, is that it just never really meshed. And what's going to become the transcendental Unitarianism that's going to come forward in the free church tradition. And there was a movement of the free church tradition in the day. Universalism was not part of that. It remained much more traditionally Christian during this time period, right? So that's kind of where you're at. Emerson dies, oh my gosh, and then we're into the 1900s. Now, one of the ideas here is the World Parliament of Religion of the 1890s that brings in Vivekananda, who is a Hindu, and he comes to Chicago and teaches about Hinduism, a very specific oneness kind of humanism. And as some of you know, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis was one of the few places that he was able to speak publicly. He was considered a person of color in the US of the day, and even in the North Country, people refused to listen to people of color speak. But the people of First Unitarian Society said, yeah, Vivekananda, you sound really cool. I think you got some great ideas. Come on down and join us. And that's how that worked. Now, another thing, of course, that had been happening during this time and why First Unitarian Society was able to ask a person of color to come in and speak to them about a foreign religion is that we had this thing called The Origin of Species, the book by Darwin. And this really sets up a tension within European and American Christianity. I'm reading a book at the moment that's falling apart. It's my airplane reading. It's called American Thought, Civil War to World War I. Wow. Yeah, it actually is fascinating if you can get past a few of the language problems. But what it says and what did happen is we had this split between what was known as idealism that goes off and remains liberally Christian, and then this other group that goes off and says, wait a minute, I think the idea of natural selection disproves the idea of a conscious God. I think that maybe the universe is self-creating, and evolution is the explanation for why this bird doesn't look like that bird and why human beings look as we do. And I don't think we need that God concept anymore. And guess what? That's where First Unitarian Society is coming out of. As I've said many times, FUS comes out of a Darwin reading group of the 1870s. They were educated people, Scandinavians, raised in Lutheran state churches, who were really ready to be done with that when they came to the US. And so they formed this group to read Darwin and try to understand the implications of natural selection. It's really pretty amazing that they were doing that at the time period, because the serious people were really wrestling with those ideas. I mean, the Harvard professors were metaphorically at each other's throats over this idea. Is it natural selection and totally chaotic as a way that life came about? Or is there still some way that we can figure out to have a God that would set that in motion? But the people of FUS pretty well decided on the side of Darwin. And that's why they were quite willing to listen to a person of color in the 1890s. Also, it is why they were quite willing to listen in 1916 to Mr. Dietrich, the defrocked minister who had decided to call himself a humanist. And thus, First Unitarian Society becomes the first humanist congregation because the people vote to bring this guy in. And he says, I'm a humanist now, and no one had ever heard of it from that terminology. And of course, Mr. Dietrich was a great reader of Darwin. Now, one problem that was going on in the Darwin ideas is Herbert Spencer, a Brit who started the idea of the survival of the fittest as an explanation for how evolution works. Unfortunately, Dietrich listened a little too closely to Herbert Spencer. He was the popular science guy in the early 20th century in the United States, but his understanding of the survival of the fittest were race theory that is now discredited, and that kind of thing. And unfortunately, Dietrich did fall into some of that, although he did begin to think his way out of it in terms of democratic socialism. And we do find out here that the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933, the second humanist minister at First Unitarian Society was very involved in writing that text, and Dietrich did sign it. Yes, all of the signers of the first Humanist Manifesto were white men, all Protestant. Many were Unitarian or Universalist ministers, or the other thing is scholars like Dewey. But what was really coming out of that at that time is that's very early in the Depression era. And so the people who sign it are democratic socialists. The New Deal had not yet gelled, but the ideas that would become the New Deal were definitely in the air of the time. And that goes right into the DNA of the humanism of the day. Now, this is called the Humanist Controversy because a lot of Unitarian ministers definitely wanted to kick those new humanist people out of the Unitarian organization. And again, there were some Universalists involved in this as well. Calling themselves humanists just was not acceptable. It turns out that they didn't do that because there's really no way in Unitarian or Universalism to declare someone a heretic. You can't try them. So if a congregation wants to be humanist and they still want to belong to what's now the Unitarian Universalist Association, they can, and we do, as a matter of fact. But First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is one of the few UU congregations that is explicitly humanist, and it's because we have this tradition of humanism. And again, it was very edgy at the time. And, it's still kind of edgy at this time. We find ourselves kind of taken aback sometimes when we get involved with the General Assembly and run into what we see as much more conventional Christian thinking and that kind of thing. But that's really the reason that happened. So if you have what we call congregational polity, every congregation can declare itself what it wants to be. In the 1880s, a lot of Universalist congregations actually become spiritualist. It was a big deal. I'm going to talk about that in Coffee and Wisdom in a couple of weeks. It's really quite fascinating that after the Civil War, there was a sudden outbreak of talking to spirits. But of course, almost everyone in the United States in the 1870s and 1880s knew someone who had been killed in the war. And so especially, many times young people, children. So they were really very much wanting to hear from the dead. And Universalism got very into that idea, and a good many Universalists became spiritualists and dropped entirely out of the Christian round at that time and stopped attending churches at all. The Unitarians were a little more skeptical about that. We've always been a little more about that reason thing. Like Houdini, we were a little bit, itchy about thinking that the dead can speak back to us. And so that didn't really happen within the Unitarian tradition. But anything can happen because within congregational polity, because the people, the members, decide what the theological direction of the congregation is going to be. You called me because I'm a humanist. I'm a Unitarian Universalist, but I'm really a humanist first. I was a humanist before I was a Unitarian Universalist, and I have remained a Unitarian Universalist for over 40 years now because they allow us humanists to be in there. And that's the only reason I would have stayed. And again, it's all about your conscious, your consciousness, how and conscience, how you feel about how true to your actual inner beliefs you have to be. And many of us humanists definitely believe that we have to be out there in terms of what we see as a naturalistic universe that's really probably not controlled by any kind of unseen spirits out there. Well, in 1961 is the consolidation of the Unitarian and Universalist faiths. What had happened after the Second World War was what we call the fellowship movement among Unitarians, and a lot of small groups were formed during that time, and they were almost all humanist. The reason they were forming is they were going to various university towns as the universities exploded with the GI Bill after the Second World War. There were scientists everywhere, and so a lot of humanist organizations occur at that time. Many of them later become churches. The one I served down in Bloomington, for example, was a fellowship that then grows up and hires a minister eventually. And Michael Cervetis congregation is an offshoot of First Unitarian Society. It too began as a reading group for people up in that part of the burbs. So the idea was spreading at that time period. Then in 1961, with the merger, the Unitarians were in the majority vastly. The Universalist tradition had been shrinking. But as soon as the merger occurs, Universalism begins to reassert itself, and it really has done that ever since. Now, Universalism wasn't Christian in 1961 all that much, but it has Universalists have really gone more toward a Christian viewpoint as the years have gone by. Kind of paradoxical in that way. But it's it's one of the facts of Unitarian Universalism over time, and we can trace that by looking at what kind of ministers were at First Universalist in Minneapolis. Again, FUS has remained humanist all that time, and all the ministers have always been some form of humanist. But First Universalist has moved away from a kind of universalist humanism back toward a more theistic kind of idea over time, as have several different congregations that are part of our group at this point. This particular timeline ends at 2003 with the third Humanist Manifesto. That is the most recent one. And this time signed by lots of women and people of color, not just a bunch of white academics, and which I'm glad. I am advocating at the moment for a new Humanist Manifesto. I believe that this one is dated in some very unfortunate ways, and I think that we need to write a new one. It's when you get a committee together to write this kind of thing, you're going to have a lot of disagreement, and so it's problematic. But I believe that it's time for us to expand the idea of humanism. That's one of the things that we're going to be talking about quite a bit this summer. Do remember that next week I'm going to be interviewing a young seminarian from South Florida whose parents are Cuban, and how this young woman of color is bringing in some new ideas into a humanist viewpoint. She has been training as a Unitarian Universalist minister, but really is kind of disillusioned with that. She's really wanting to go much more toward humanism, which is why she's studying with me in the Humanist program at the American Humanist Association. And I think she brings a very interesting perspective. And so you can really see that going on. Someone who grew up as a strict Roman Catholic and then began to expand out into studying Buddhism and that kind of thing. And it's a fascinating story. And it's part of what, again, we can do because FUS is specifically humanist. So she can study to be a humanist celebrant rather than a Unitarian Universalist minister. And that's kind of where that's going at the moment. Then July 18th, we are going to reopen our building, and I hope that you will be joining us. We're going to have a good time reopening our building and getting back at it. And then we're going to stay open for the summer and have some fascinating people. We're going to have Jay Hooper coming in to talk about the hermeneutics of the black body. What is that? Well, you'll have to wait and see, but he's writing a dissertation that I am one of the advisors on about a young black man who was taken in as a Christian, but probably didn't actually become a Christian. He probably held on to his animistic practices from Africa. And it's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating story about how white Christians co-opt the black body, the black mind, black religion, and yeah, you'll like it a lot. And of course, Jay Hooper is an affiliated humanist celebrant with First Unitarian Society. And some other speakers this year as well over the summer, trying to get some looks at some younger people and how younger people are dealing with humanism and navigating the waters of Unitarian Universalism as they go along. Well, I can talk a half an hour without taking a breath almost. So that's Question Box for today. I hope you have a really, really wonderful kind of 4th of July holiday. I'm going to be flying at about the time that fireworks go off there, but I hope you have a really wonderful day, and thanks a lot for tuning in, and we will see you next week. And of course, as you know, summer, we have our Coffee and Wisdom live Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 a.m. and join in, and we talk about this sort of history and ideas all the time. So I'll be reading my book today as I wait on all the planes, and I should be able to talk about American thought, Civil War to World War I. So there you go. Thanks a lot, and have a really, really great holiday.